Salams, this is People's Dispatch and you're watching the daily debrief coming to you from our studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and on the show today there's plenty to talk to our reporters about, including judgment on Afghan central bank money that's been seized by the United States. We're talking about why the Philippines and Australia are discussing joint Coast Guard patrols in the South China Sea. And finally, the impact of mass mobilizations in the healthcare sector in the UK and what wider impact it might have across Europe. First up, a district judge in the United States has ruled that family members of victims of the September 11, 2001 terror attacks are not entitled to funds from Afghanistan's central bank. In a ruling on the 21st of Feb, US Judge George Daniels said that awarding the families money seized from Da Afghanistan Bank, known as DAB, would first require the US to assess that the Taliban is the legitimate government of Afghanistan. It's a decision that he said he was constitutionally restrained from making. A reminder to our viewers at this point that in Feb 2022, the Joe Biden administration issued a controversial order stating that it would split $7 billion in frozen assets from Afghanistan's central bank between the Afghan people and families of 9/11 victims who sued the Taliban. Abdul Rahman has been tracking developments on this front since then and joins us now in studio with the latest. Abdul, good to have you in studio today. On the face of it, this ruling by a district judge in the US is a good thing because it at least stops for the time being that money that is owned by the Afghan central bank to be spent for other purposes, whatever they might be, whether 9/11 related or anything else. But what is the legal status of these funds, and does this mean that Afghans who are currently suffering one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, anytime in the near future might see access through the government or various channels to any of this money?
Well, that is a political decision. Legally, no. There is no chance of them getting their money back anytime soon. Primarily because this is a verdict of a district court which can be appealed, and the petitioners have already spoken in public, claiming that they are going to this judgment is not legal. In fact, they have questioned the legality of the judgment, questioned the reasoning on which the judgment was based, which is basically the Taliban government need to be recognized before the US government can take such action of seizing the money deposited in its central bank and so on and so forth. Hence, of course, it means that there will be a legal proceeding, there will be appeal filed in the next courts, and it means that we don't know when will that process will be exhausted. So it means in the coming days, in the near future, the money is not going to come back to the Afghans, and whether it is also not very sure whether it will come back to the Afghans at all. It may be that the upper courts and the other courts may take a different position. It's all about interpretation, and we don't know.
Yeah, but like you were mentioning, I mean, the judge seeming to say that he's constitutionally bound to make this decision because of the technicality that the United States has not recognized the Taliban as the legitimate people in power in Afghanistan, even though de facto, I suppose, they have. But how does that anyway sort of deal with the issue of this money being taken and used for 9/11 victims who have lawsuits filed in the US? Because if the Taliban is recognized, does that mean if the Taliban is recognized as the government, then Afghanistan as a nation is held responsible for those events?
Exactly. That is the if you read the whatever little is there in the public domain about the judgment, that is the basic point in which the judgment is based. And the people who are opposing this particular move are also arguing the same, that even if the US government tomorrow, for the technical purposes, recognizes the Taliban government and claims the money, the $7 billion, at least half of it, they are saying, they claim over it, whether that will be justified or not. Of course, as per the principles in international politics, as per the beliefs and the conventions which the humanity has followed for generations, even that is not justified for the simple reason that Taliban is one group. It is not Afghanistan. The people and the money is of course the people of Afghanistan are the ultimate owners of the money, and therefore even if Taliban is responsible for the act of 9/11, which is not established, by the way. Taliban was not directly involved. The people who were involved, most of them were Saudi
Not
citizens,
Afghan
and they were
nationals,
a group which was not Afghan group, not backed by Taliban. Of course, there is a leader, one leader of that particular group, which was allegedly sheltered by the Taliban government at the time. But no US legislation, no US court verdict has held Taliban responsible yet for the acts of 9/11. Hence, if a group, even that group which comes to power, is not responsible for the acts of 9/11 so far, of course, even recognizing it and taking back the money because you think that it is responsible has no legal basis. So, of course, there can be various interpretation, and in the law, that is one thing which none of us can argue conclusively about.
Right.
But common sense and conventions, the existing conventions in global politics, rule that such act would not be justified.
All right. Thanks very much for that, Abdul. We'll, of course, ask you to keep tracking things as they proceed, and also maybe sometime later on to see what the DAB's stand is on this and how they are even engaging with this legal process altogether in the US. Next up, Australia and the Philippines are exploring the possibility of joint patrols in the South China Sea. This is according to Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles, who was speaking on Wednesday after talks with his Philippine counterpart, Carlitos Galvez Jr. Marles said the joint patrols by the coast guards of both nations are on the anvil. The statements seem a direct response to China and come shortly after the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines was summoned by President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. after what they called, or the Philippines that is, aggressive activities by the Chinese Coast Guard towards a Philippine vessel. Anish joins us now. He covers the region and has more details on this developing story. Anish, good to have you back with us. First up, whenever these kind of conversations come up, Anish, the first, or sort of the context to it is something that China seems to have done to have led to a response or a reaction on the part of what is essentially the US and its allies in the region. What do you make of these recent events and is involving coast guards now as opposed to the navies of these two states? Is that in any way a route to de-escalating situation?
But it's not necessarily an attempt of de-escalation. What we have seen so far under the new Marcos administration, the Marcos Jr. administration, it has, ever since it came to power, its foreign policy has often veered towards making stronger sort of military alliances with the US and its allies in the region. This is a very, we have spoken about this before when Philippines is now talking about a sort of free visiting forces agreement sort of thing with Japan. And that statement already made it very clear how Philippines is right now trying to take a side in the tensions that is simmering between China and the United States, something that the previous Duterte administration, despite the problems that the administration had, not only in domestic issues, but also in foreign policy issues. But they try to stay off from that, stay away from such tensions. They stayed away from taking any sides and tried to take a more practical approach when it came to dealing with China and also the United States. And so despite his claims, the president's claims of continuing the previous administration's policies, this is a very clear shift from the previous administration's moves. And that is what we are seeing with trying to create a sort of joint patrol with coast guards with Australia. Obviously, it is not going for an all-out sort of military alliances with any of these nations as of now. Even the United, because that has always been a very touchy subject in the Philippines civil society. Even with talks about expanding U.S. presence, military presence through the visiting forces agreement has been quite contentious right now. To add more countries into the mix is going to obviously be problematic. And we have to remember all these talks about the dispute, the South China Sea dispute. It is a dispute, it is a multilateral dispute on one hand, but neither Australia nor Japan nor the United States or any of the countries are involved in this, even though Philippines is trying to rope them into into trying to apparently create defenses for or geared towards this dispute.
Right. So in that context, Anish, since you were talking about those that are or nations that are multilaterally involved in the exact disputes, the ASEAN grouping of Southeast Asian nations is perhaps the correct forum in that sense to have some of those conversations. And China and Indonesia recently coming out with a statement that there is some movement on a dialogue towards a code of conduct in the South China Sea. What details do you have on that front?
Yeah, it is a very interesting development happening also at the same time that these talks about Philippines and Australia are thinking about joint patrol. And it is quite interesting because obviously the manner in which the coverage around the South China Sea dispute has happened, we would be under the impression that the dispute has escalated to almost no return sort of levels, but that is not really the case. It is still a multilateral dispute involving about 7 countries, and each of them having their own version of what their claims are. And the claims do not necessarily stop at just territorial disputes. We have to remember it's basically just 3 or 4 countries that are involved that have territorial claims that are disputed, but it's the larger claims of maritime borders and also borders of the exclusive economic zone, which can actually give you exclusive rights over mining and fishing and so on and so forth. So all of these things are at the heart of this this dispute. And obviously the free movement of trade and goods and people in the region is something that is also at the heart of the dispute, because obviously any kind of escalation will affect all of that and can have an impact not just the Asia Pacific or the Southeast Asia or the Chinese economy, but the global economy as a whole. So it is in each of these disputing party in their interest to actually have a more amicable solution, at least in the short run, and for maybe dialogue for a long-term, stable, resolution. And for that, obviously, this talk about having a code of conduct is the first step forward. But we have seen talks about code of conduct which happening since 2002. So it has been already nearly more than 2 decades that such talks have happened, and nothing really came out of it. But nevertheless, as tensions are rising and as all of these nations are talking about having dialogue with China on the matter, we have to wait and see how it unravels, because obviously having a code of conduct a binding code of conduct can actually impact how talks of sovereignty, talks of claims can actually move forward. So it is something that really needs to be closely watched. We have to again, at the end of the day, to remember all of this is a legacy of the colonial, maneuvers and claims and overtures in the region. Not only the French, but the United States and Japan, who have created this mess to begin with. But it is now these countries that really need to solve it, and nobody else, no other third party can actually, quote unquote, help them out in this matter. So this is something that that is a multilateral issue, and that has to be done in proper forums.
All right, thanks for that update, Anish. And finally, as we've reported before on People's Dispatch, thousands of ambulance workers and other medical staff in the United Kingdom on Monday staged a strike against long-standing pay, understaffing and other work-related issues. The two unions representing ambulance workers, paramedics, emergency care assistants and call handlers, which are of course the GMB union as well as the Unite union, confirmed that over 11,000 members took part in the strike. Anna Vrachar of the People's Health Movement joins us now to understand what impact the strike has had, as well as what is happening in the wider context of public health on the European continent. Anna, welcome back to Daily Debrief. Good to have you with us today. We've talked about it a few times on this show and elsewhere on People's Dispatch, of course, that the health sector in the UK has been mobilizing consistently with the same set of demands, better pay, better work conditions, higher staffing levels. The latest strike by ambulance workers and other allied healthcare professionals, it's been a couple of days now. What has been the impact of this action? Is dialogue between various parties, between the unions, the government and employers proceeding in any way?
Well, that's right. So essentially, health workers in the UK continue with unprecedented action when we're talking about strikes and, healthcare sector mobilizations. One of the latest news that has come up just late yesterday, so it is that the government has finally agreed, that the health secretary had finally agreed to open negotiations with the Royal College of Nursing. So that would make a major step forward in the ongoing discussions that we have seen in the UK. However, this shouldn't be taken as a sign that things will calm down soon, because it's in a very early stage. And it's not quite clear what the outcome of this discussion will be. What the news means is that for now, one part of the nursing unions, they have postponed, they have cancelled actually the strike that was supposed to happen from the 1st of March, which would be the longest action, the longest industrial action that the health sector in the UK has seen until now. The second news that I think we should mention here is something that came up essentially a couple of days ago from the British Medical Association, and which is a very important thing that concerns junior doctors' actions that will also happen in March. So just like nurses, just like ambulance workers, just as other healthcare and allied staff have pointed out, junior doctors in the UK have seen a tremendous cut to their pay over the last, essentially since 2008. So it's something that has been going on for quite a bit of time. And now they have done a ballot vote, and an overwhelming majority of the junior doctors in the BMA has voted in favor of the strike. So that's another blow to the government and another group that is actually mobilizing, and that will probably impact the access to healthcare and the way that healthcare is organized in the UK in the next month or so. So, but of course, as all the health workers have pointed out until now, so have the junior doctors, is that actually the strike is not only for their salary, it's not only for their working conditions, it's also a strike for a better NHS. And, as we have heard from the nurses during their previous strikes, one of the major points of contention in this discussion is that the NHS has been disregarded by the government for decades now. It has been defunded, it has been attacked through budget cuts, through austerity measures, through prioritizing in different ways, direct or indirect, of basically putting highlights on the private sector, on what private providers can do, instead of investing in the NHS and in its staff.
Right. And we are seeing similar kind of austerity-related measures from governments across Europe, Anna. So how significant is it in the wider context of what's happening in the sense of public-funded health systems and how they are being, like you said, consistently over time degraded and defunded? Is it likely to sort of coalesce into some kind of wider movement, as it were, to reinvigorate public health systems across the continent?
Well, again, I think it's an interesting time that we're seeing in Europe, at least where health workers and their actions are concerned. The UK has taken the news because the industrial actions, the strikes have spanned not only in the health sector but also outside. So we're seeing a mass mobilization against the rising cost of living in the UK. But we are seeing similar things happening in other countries in Europe too. So there's an ongoing strike by primary healthcare providers in Spain, which we have talked about here several times. But also it has to be pointed out that health workers are an essential part of the struggle against pension reforms that's going on in France as we speak, and that's actually picking up momentum in the lead up to the first weeks of March, where we should see how things with this reform would go. And then there are other instances, other examples of how health workers are actually organizing against the bad conditions that they have been exposed to because of austerity, because of privatization of public health systems. And if we focus on those, we can talk about nurses in Georgia who are, supported by local unions. They are trying to mobilize for better salaries, which are tremendously low, actually, especially if you consider the region which we are talking about. But also nurses in countries like Slovenia, and nurses in Slovenia are actually holding a protest today in front of the government because of the low staffing levels and also of the inadequate raise of salaries that they have been witnessing in comparison to other health workers, namely doctors, those senior doctors mostly.
Yeah.
So it's something that's picking up across Europe, and it's interesting to see because although there are local differences, of course, most of the health systems have been exposed to mass privatization. And this is something that health movements and health workers also have been warning against for years. So now we're actually seeing the effects of the privatization, of the commercialization kicking in, especially after COVID-19, especially after health systems are forced to carry an increasingly big burden of the people's needs. So it's definitely something that's going to continue for a while. And yes, it's still to be seen if it's going to converge in a unified health movement in Europe. But hopefully, yes, the health workers are seeing the different connections between them.
All right. Thanks very much for that update, Anna. And we'll also be talking soon about the G20 finance ministers meeting that's beginning under India's presidency this year. And one of the issues that is supposed to be on the agenda is the state of global health. So it'd be interesting to see how the concerns of those who are working in the healthcare sector feature in the discussions that the decision makers finally have. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks.
That's a wrap for this episode of the Daily Debrief from Anna, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch. Thank you very much for watching. As always, we ask you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on all of these stories as well as all of the other work we do. Also, don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back again, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.